The war that unfolded across Europe in the 1940s was, at its heart, a struggle over resources as much as it was a clash of ideologies and armies. German soldiers learned this truth the hard way when they discovered, from the very outset, that fuel was the lifeblood of modern mechanized conflict. Without oil, tanks became steel coffins, aircraft were nothing but grounded hulks, and trucks sat idle, turning once mighty formations into little more than infantry columns. From the first campaigns in Poland and France, German officers were already wary of their nation's limited oil supplies, and by the time the war expanded eastward into the vast territories of the Soviet Union, the cracks in their logistical foundations were glaring. What German soldiers did not yet realize, however, was that their opponents across the Atlantic, the United States, possessed fuel reserves so vast and industrial capabilities so immense that the very idea of running out seemed laughable. The German army, though formidable, was born into a system of scarcity. Even in the 1930s, before open war began, the Nazi leadership was acutely aware that Germany lacked sufficient petroleum resources of its own. The Reich imported heavily from Romania and the Soviet Union, but such sources were vulnerable to political shifts and eventual conquest. Ordinary soldiers at the front would later recount how fuel rations dictated every movement. Entire panzer units were sometimes ordered to halt because the promised convoys of gasoline had not arrived. A battalion might be tasked with seizing a city, only to wait idly while higher command debated whether they could spare the fuel for the offensive. This constant shadow of shortage became a defining experience for German troops. They learned to calculate not just distance and enemy strength, but also whether there would be enough gasoline to bring them home again. Against this backdrop, the industrial landscape of America appeared almost surreal. While Germany scrambled to synthesize fuel from coal and sought new oil fields in conquered lands, the United States was already the world's leading oil producer. Texas, Oklahoma, and California pumped millions of barrels each month, and refineries turned crude into high-octane gasoline on a scale unimaginable to most Europeans. German propaganda attempted to downplay this reality, painting America as decadent and unprepared. Yet the men on the ground, pilots who faced endless squadrons of American bombers, tank crews who were driven back by seemingly unending streams of Shermans, could not ignore what their eyes told them. The Americans had fuel, and they had it without end. The shortage shaped every German campaign. In the North African desert, Rommel's Afrika Korps became legendary for their daring maneuvers, but their effectiveness was constantly crippled by fuel scarcity. German soldiers joked grimly that they fought more against empty fuel drums than against the British. Supply ships sent across the Mediterranean were sunk by Allied navies, leaving tanks stranded in the sand. At the front lines, soldiers grew accustomed to siphoning fuel from wrecked vehicles or rationing it so strictly that trucks moved only under cover of darkness. In their diaries, many soldiers wrote with envy about stories they heard of American units, where jeeps ran almost casually, supply trucks thundered without pause, and aircraft operated as if the sky itself carried an endless reserve. In the vast expanses of the Soviet Union, this imbalance grew more pronounced. German soldiers, slogging through mud and snow, often relied on horse-drawn wagons, a bitter reminder of pre-industrial times, while they read captured American magazines boasting of mass-produced automobiles and tractors that symbolized mechanized abundance. Soldiers at the front whispered among themselves that the real enemy was not only the Red Army, but also the ocean of oil standing behind the Allies. Every rumor of America's industrial scale stung with a mixture of disbelief and dread. Could it really be true that American soldiers received more gasoline in a day than a German division might see in a week? For German troops, this realization came gradually. Early victories in Europe concealed the structural weaknesses of their supply chain, but the longer the war dragged on, the more they felt the suffocating grip of fuel starvation. Officers scrawled angry notes in their reports, pleading for more deliveries that never came. Tank crews sat idle for days, their machines useless without the precious black liquid. Soldiers cursed the endless bureaucracy that doled out fuel in dribbles, and all the while whispers grew louder. The Americans would never know such shortages. Their refineries worked day and night, and their convoys stretched across the oceans, guarded by fleets too vast to be stopped. Thus, from the very beginning of their campaigns, German soldiers found themselves trapped between ambition and limitation. They belonged to an army that dreamed of lightning war, but one that too often sputtered on empty tanks. Even before they fully encountered America's colossal supply system, they understood they were playing a dangerous game. The war would not only be decided by bullets and courage, it would be decided by barrels of oil. And in that contest, Germany was already dangerously behind. Across the Atlantic, the scale of America's oil empire was unlike anything German soldiers could comprehend. In Germany, fuel was measured out with agonizing caution, each barrel counted, each convoy carefully rationed. In the United States, it seemed as though rivers of oil poured endlessly from the ground. By the early 1940s, America was producing more petroleum than the rest of the world combined. Fields in Texas, Oklahoma, and California generated millions of barrels every month, and vast refineries transformed that crude into gasoline, diesel, lubricants, and aviation fuel. German soldiers who had grown accustomed to shortages and improvisation could scarcely believe the numbers when they were finally revealed to them after capture or by rumor on the front lines. To them, oil was a rare treasure. To the Americans, it was as common as water. The infrastructure behind this abundance was staggering. In states like Texas, derricks dotted the horizon for miles, forests of steel pumping tirelessly. Railways carried tank cars day and night to refineries that operated on a scale unmatched anywhere in Europe. The Port of Houston, the Port of Los Angeles, and refineries in New Jersey worked around the clock to churn out refined products ready to be shipped across the world. For every gallon of fuel the Germans squeezed from coal through complex and costly chemical processes, the Americans could refine hundreds with ease. The war, in essence, was already tilted by this imbalance, even if soldiers at the front did not yet fully grasp its implications. German military planners had always known this weakness. The obsession with the Caucasus oil fields in the Soviet Union was not a matter of prestige, it was born of necessity. Without access to major reserves, Germany would never sustain a long war. The Wehrmacht's campaigns were designed for short, decisive blows precisely because the Reich could not support drawn-out mechanized conflict. Yet America thrived on long wars. Its reserves and industrial base made it possible to keep factories running without pause, to keep fleets supplied with endless streams of fuel, and to ensure that every new division raised could be fully motorized. For German soldiers used to watching their trucks stand idle, this was an unthinkable luxury. Stories circulated quickly among the troops. German POWs captured in North Africa and later interrogated by Allied officers often expressed amazement at what they saw in American supply depots. Barrels stacked as far as the eye could see, convoys of tank trucks idling with engines running, aircraft hangars with massive storage tanks feeding lines of bombers. One prisoner recalled that it seemed like every American vehicle drank gasoline as though it cost nothing. Another said bitterly that his unit had been ordered to ration fuel so tightly that even heating stoves had to be shut down, while the Americans drove their jeeps casually around camp just to fetch coffee. For German soldiers conditioned to treat fuel as more valuable than food, this careless abundance was shocking. The refineries themselves became targets of German propaganda. Newspapers and radio broadcasts railed against America's decadent oil addiction, claiming that such waste could not last. But soldiers at the front, especially those who encountered American forces in Italy and France, knew better. They watched as convoys of American trucks poured through supply lines, as tanks advanced without pause, as aircraft circled overhead with no fear of running out of aviation fuel. The realization sank in. The war was not merely a contest of weapons, but of resources, and in that contest, America stood on an entirely different level. Even within Germany's highest ranks, this truth was acknowledged in frustration. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, later admitted that Germany's defeat was sealed not just by military setbacks, but by the overwhelming superiority of Allied resources, chief among them oil. For the ordinary German soldier, this superiority was visible in daily humiliations: stalled vehicles, abandoned equipment, and the endless grind of marching on foot while the enemy seemed to glide effortlessly forward on wheels. The knowledge that the Americans possessed practically limitless fuel reserves gnawed at morale. Soldiers muttered that no matter how skilled their officers were, no matter how hard they fought, they were up against an enemy that simply could not run out. As the war dragged on, the contrast between German scarcity and American abundance grew more extreme. Synthetic fuel plants in Germany became bombing targets, and each raid tightened the noose further. Meanwhile, new oil fields in the United States and Mexico continued to expand production. By 1944, America's oil output was not only supplying its own massive war machine, but also sustaining its allies. To German soldiers who struggled to fill the tanks of a single panzer regiment, this global generosity was incomprehensible. They began to see that the true might of America did not lie only in its factories or its manpower, but in the black gold beneath its soil, an endless reserve that no U-boat campaign, no blitzkrieg, and no desperate counteroffensive could ever hope to match. By the time German armored divisions clashed with Allied forces on the battlefields of Europe and North Africa, the fuel disparity was no longer an abstract concept. It was a daily, bitter reality. German tank crews, who had once spearheaded lightning offensives during the early blitzkrieg campaigns, now found themselves waiting idly beside their machines, their engines cold, their missions postponed or cancelled because fuel convoys had failed to arrive. For the ordinary soldier, this was maddening. They were trained for speed, for shock, for rapid thrusts deep into enemy lines, but instead they often stood helpless as opportunities slipped away, all because the precious gasoline was missing. What German soldiers could not comprehend was how different the situation was for their American counterparts, who seemed to enjoy an endless supply of fuel no matter where they fought. In North Africa, the contrast became painfully visible. Erwin Rommel's Africa Corps gained legendary status for tactical brilliance, but their struggles with fuel shortages were equally legendary. German soldiers were accustomed to scrounging from every available source. Crews siphoned fuel from wrecked vehicles, bartered with Italian allies for a few extra gallons, or even attempted to filter impure local supplies just to keep their engines running. Every liter was guarded like treasure. Soldiers would leave trucks parked in the shade for days, unwilling to waste even the smallest amount on unnecessary movement. When orders came to advance, the question was not whether the enemy could be beaten, but whether the tanks would even reach the battlefield. The thought of American tanks, which seemed always to arrive fully fueled and ready, gnawed at their morale like a slow poison. On the Eastern Front, the situation grew even worse. The sheer size of Russia demanded massive quantities of fuel for any mechanized force to operate effectively. German soldiers slogged through mud and snow while their panzers sat useless without gasoline. Diaries and letters from soldiers tell of tanks being abandoned because they could not be refueled, left behind for the Soviets to capture or destroy. Meanwhile, rumors spread of the Americans sending convoy after convoy of fuel across the Atlantic, enough not only to supply their own armies, but to keep the British and even the Soviets fighting at full strength. For soldiers accustomed to hardship, this seemed impossible. How could one nation provide fuel for itself and its allies when Germany struggled to provide for even a single front? The shock grew deeper as German soldiers began to observe American units directly. In Italy and later in France, captured soldiers and civilians described the overwhelming presence of American convoys, long columns of trucks, each brimming with gasoline, advancing with a confidence that only abundance could provide. German soldiers who had been taught to conserve every drop watched in disbelief as American jeeps ran continuously, engines idling while drivers stopped to chat or light cigarettes. They saw supply depots with barrels stacked like walls, seemingly without end, guarded casually, as though there could never be a shortage. To them, this was the most surreal sight of the war. An enemy who treated the very fuel Germany craved as if it were inexhaustible. The imbalance had tactical consequences that every German soldier could feel. Panzer divisions, once the pride of the Wehrmacht, grew increasingly limited in scope. A breakthrough might be achieved, only for the advance to halt because the fuel train lagged behind. Retreats turned chaotic when tanks ran dry and had to be destroyed to avoid capture. Soldiers cursed not only their enemy, but their own high command, who promised victories yet failed to provide the lifeblood required to achieve them. The Americans, by contrast, advanced with a smooth inevitability. Their tanks rolled steadily, their trucks delivered supplies without pause, and their air support always arrived on schedule. It seemed as if the war for them was never constrained by the question of, "Do we have enough fuel?" a question that haunted German troops at every step. The psychological toll was immense. For German soldiers, the knowledge that they were fighting not only against armies, but against a resource empire weighed heavily. It meant that every hard-fought victory felt fragile, every setback catastrophic. When they captured Allied equipment, they marveled not only at the machines themselves, but at the fact that these machines were always ready to run, always supported by a system that never faltered. In whispered conversations, they admitted to one another that no amount of courage could change this reality. Tanks without fuel were just metal carcasses. Trucks without gasoline were dead weight. Airplanes without aviation fuel were useless hulks. And against an enemy that seemed to possess fuel without end, their own efforts began to feel futile. Thus, in the dust of deserts and the mud of the Eastern Front, German soldiers came face to face with a truth that would follow them throughout the war. While their tanks stalled, American engines roared. And for men who had once believed their mechanized might was invincible, the discovery that fuel scarcity could cripple them more thoroughly than enemy bullets was a lesson they would never forget. As the war stretched into its middle years, German soldiers began to learn about the scale and resilience of America's fuel convoys, the arteries that pumped black gold across the oceans. At first, there had been hope in the Reich that U-boats, prowling the Atlantic, would sever those lifelines. German submariners boasted of the tonnage war, claiming that each Allied ship sunk would starve Britain and bleed the Americans of resources. But the reality that slowly dawned on ordinary German soldiers was very different. For every tanker sunk, it seemed as though two more reached their destination. Convoys stretched across the Atlantic in great herds, guarded by destroyers, cruisers, and eventually escort carriers. Where German troops expected collapse, they saw only abundance arriving on Allied shores. To a soldier freezing in Russia or stranded in the deserts of Tunisia, the very idea of oil tankers arriving endlessly in Britain or North Africa was nearly incomprehensible. Yet the reports filtered down. American engineers had laid down pipelines under the English Channel, ensuring that once D-Day arrived, gasoline could flow directly into France. Soldiers who had been ordered to siphon fuel from wrecked tanks were told, almost mockingly, that the Americans could afford to lay entire underwater fuel lines as casually as one might roll out a garden hose. The contrast was painful and demoralizing. Germany scraped for every liter. America seemed to conjure oceans of it. The convoys were not just impressive in their scale, but in their reliability. German soldiers were used to waiting days or weeks for supplies to catch up with them. They grew bitter when fuel ran out at critical moments, leaving tanks silent and vulnerable. But Allied convoys, powered by America's industrial engine, ensured that their armies almost never experienced such paralysis. Captured German officers admitted after the war that they were stunned by how consistent American logistics proved to be. To them, the steady stream of fuel was as terrifying as any weapon. A tank could be destroyed, a plane shot down, but America's convoys were like a tide, relentless, unending, impossible to stop. For many German soldiers, the first direct evidence of this came during the Italian campaign. They witnessed convoys rolling ashore at Naples, Salerno, and Anzio, bringing not just weapons and men, but an ocean of fuel. The sight of tankers unloading barrels in organized mountains, of trucks lined in endless columns, was unforgettable. German defenders in Italy fought bravely, but they could not ignore that their enemies' machines never seemed to stall. Each American advance was backed by fuel convoys so reliable that entire offensives were launched without hesitation. German troops, who had to weigh each liter of gasoline before moving a vehicle, realized they faced an opponent for whom fuel was not even a concern. U-boat crews continued to sink ships, but Allied innovations such as radar, sonar, and air patrols steadily blunted the threat. German soldiers, reading propaganda claiming that Britain would soon collapse from lack of supplies, became disillusioned when they saw the opposite unfolding. American fuel not only kept Britain alive, but also strengthened it to strike back. Soldiers muttered that their leaders had underestimated America's ability to wage global war. "They build ships faster than we can sink them," one infantryman wrote in his diary. The grim truth was undeniable. German efforts to starve their enemy had failed, while their own shortages deepened. By 1944, when Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, German soldiers facing the invasion confronted a new and terrifying reality. Behind the tanks and planes that landed in France stood logistical lines of unprecedented strength. The Red Ball Express, a massive American trucking operation, carried gasoline from the beaches to the front lines in an endless stream of vehicles. German defenders, already weakened, could only watch as the Allies poured fuel into Europe as though the continent itself had become another American oil field. The shock was profound. They had spent years rationing every drop, while their opponents could literally pave the roads with gasoline. The convoys of black gold, moving across oceans and continents, represented the true heart of America's war machine. German soldiers may have fought bravely, but bravery alone could not refill empty fuel tanks. Against convoys that never ceased, their own efforts felt small and futile. They realized that even if they managed to destroy enemy units in battle, more would simply arrive, fully fueled, fully supplied, and ready to fight. And so, while propaganda insisted that victory was near, the soldiers themselves knew that as long as America's convoys continued to flow, the outcome was already decided. For German soldiers, one of the most demoralizing revelations of the war came from the skies. Air power, they had been taught, was decisive only if used with precision and timing. But for the Americans, it seemed as though air power was limited by nothing at all. Endless bombers crossed the skies in formations so vast that they blotted out the sun. Squadrons of fighters swept over battlefields in waves, attacking again and again, as if they could never run out of the fuel that kept their engines roaring. German soldiers, huddled in trenches or manning flak guns, often whispered in disbelief. How could the Americans afford to keep their planes in the air so relentlessly? The Luftwaffe, once feared as a dominant force, was by the mid-war years fighting desperately to preserve what little remained of its fuel. Pilots often trained only minimally before being thrown into combat, their flight hours restricted to save gasoline. Veteran pilots complained that they could not keep their edge with so little practice, while recruits hardly knew how to handle their aircraft before being forced into dogfights. On the ground, German soldiers saw the consequences: fewer planes taking off, fewer squadrons in the sky, and an ever-dwindling ability to resist Allied bombing campaigns. Meanwhile, American pilots flew with such regularity that it seemed as if training itself consumed more fuel than Germany could spare for its entire air force. The Americans did not merely match German sorties, they multiplied them. Fuel abundance allowed for continuous bombing runs across industrial targets, railroads, and cities deep inside the Reich. German soldiers stationed in France or Italy spoke of the constant rumble of bombers overhead day and night, a sound that became the background noise of war. They watched with bitterness as their anti-aircraft guns fired into the skies, often to little effect, because the bombers always returned the next day as if nothing had been lost. To the men on the ground, it was as though America possessed an infinite fleet of planes, each one backed by rivers of fuel that Germany could never hope to match. On the front lines, where American fighter bombers prowled, German troops came to dread the distinctive growl of engines. The Jabos, as they called them, attacked convoys, trains, and even individual soldiers whenever movement was spotted. German accounts tell of units trying to march only at night, hiding under trees by day, because to move in daylight was to invite certain destruction. They cursed the fact that these aircraft seemed to fly without pause, circling overhead from dawn to dusk. What they did not fully understand, but gradually realized, was that American logistical systems ensured that fuel shortages were non-existent. Where German pilots were rationed to the bone, American pilots had fuel to spare, allowing them to dominate every sky. Perhaps the most shocking revelation for captured German soldiers was learning about the scale of American aviation fuel production. By 1944, the United States was refining not only enough gasoline for its massive fleets of bombers and fighters, but also providing aviation fuel for the British and even the Soviets. German prisoners expressed disbelief when shown reports that Allied pilots trained for hundreds of hours before seeing combat. "We could not even dream of such waste," one Luftwaffe prisoner admitted. To German soldiers on the ground, this explained everything: the relentlessness of American air power, the endless flights that shadowed them, and the crushing sense that the skies had been lost forever. The psychological impact of this dominance cannot be overstated. German infantrymen grew weary, demoralized, and even fatalistic. They realized that no matter how hard they fought on the ground, their movements could be spotted and crushed from above. The roar of Allied planes became synonymous with defeat. For those who had once believed in German technological superiority, it was humiliating to admit that their enemies could sustain such constant pressure. The knowledge spread quickly through the ranks. The Americans had an oil empire behind them, and that empire had given them the skies. By the final years of the war, German soldiers no longer asked if an air raid was coming, but only when. The skies belonged to the Allies, and the reason was simple. While German pilots sat idle for want of fuel, the Americans burned through barrels without hesitation. That imbalance sealed the fate of countless German soldiers who came to understand that in modern war, control of the skies was not just about aircraft, it was about the fuel that kept them airborne. When German soldiers were finally captured, many found themselves in camps across North Africa, Britain, and later the United States. It was there, away from the front lines, that the most shocking truths about America's fuel wealth revealed themselves. Soldiers who had grown used to conserving every drop of gasoline, who had fought battles stalled by empty fuel tanks, now observed American soldiers treating fuel as though it were no more valuable than water. For the Germans, this was not only astonishing, it was almost incomprehensible. In POW camps located on American soil, German prisoners were stunned by what they saw in daily routines. Trucks roared constantly through the camps, sometimes moving supplies only a short distance, their engines left idling for hours. Guards casually drove jeeps from one end of a compound to another, even when walking would have sufficed. German soldiers whispered among themselves in disbelief. In the Reich, an officer might cancel an entire maneuver for lack of fuel, while here an American private could use it freely without a second thought. To men who had siphoned fuel from wrecks and carried cans across miles of battlefield, this was a different world altogether. Testimonies from captured soldiers later revealed how deeply this affected them. One German tank crewman remarked that while his unit had often received fuel rations so small that they could not even warm food over a fire, American units used gasoline for cooking, heating, and even burning trash. Another recalled with bitterness that his entire division had been forced to abandon working tanks outside Kharkov because no fuel could be found, while in captivity he saw Americans practicing with trucks and jeeps simply to maintain driving skills. These sights, more than any lecture or propaganda, convinced them that Germany had entered a war it could not win. The shock extended to aviation fuel as well. German prisoners interrogated about their experiences were frequently asked about the Luftwaffe's shortages, and they spoke openly of pilots limited to a handful of training hours. In return, American officers described how U.S. pilots flew constantly, even in training squadrons that never saw combat. For German POWs, this was maddening. Some simply refused to believe it until they saw American training fields with their own eyes. Rows of planes taking off one after another, burning gallons of fuel by the minute as if it were nothing. The realization that America could afford to waste what Germany desperately lacked broke down the last illusions of parity. In Europe as well, German soldiers captured during the campaigns in France and Italy gave similar accounts. They remembered the first time they were marched past American supply depots, endless rows of barrels stacked higher than their heads, guarded not with the intensity one would expect for such precious cargo, but almost casually, because there was always more to come. Some described how, while waiting in captivity, they watched convoys of trucks deliver fuel non-stop to the front lines, never interrupted by shortage or delay. For men who had fought entire battles around the question of whether fuel would arrive in time, the casual abundance of their captors was both humiliating and terrifying. Even more bitter was the realization that America's soldiers lived lives saturated with petroleum products in every form. Motorized kitchens, mobile hospitals, even showers and laundry facilities, all operated with fuel that Germans could scarcely imagine having at the front. A captured infantryman later wrote that he realized, sitting in a camp, that "we never truly fought against men, but against oil itself." To him, the war had always been unbalanced, because one side never had to think about fuel, while the other thought of little else. The disbelief of German prisoners hardened into reluctant respect. They acknowledged that courage and tactical brilliance could only go so far when confronted with such logistical supremacy. Many admitted after the war that they understood their defeat was not solely due to battlefield mistakes or poor leadership, but to the simple fact that America's oil empire had given it an inexhaustible advantage. The men who had once believed in blitzkrieg now understood that speed meant nothing without gasoline. Their shock, born of first-hand observation, was a recognition of reality. The United States fought a mechanized war powered by fuel supplies so vast that no army in Europe could ever hope to match them. As the war ground on, the scale of American logistics revealed itself most clearly, not just in the air or on the seas, but in the sheer mechanization of their armies on land. German soldiers, who so often trudged forward on blistered feet or sat behind horse-drawn wagons, were stunned by the sight of endless columns of American trucks, jeeps, and half-tracks stretching across the horizon. The contrast was impossible to ignore. For every horse pulling a German supply cart, there seemed to be a dozen American trucks roaring past, fueled without hesitation, carrying food, ammunition, and fuel itself to the front lines. For Germans used to conserving every liter, the motorized juggernaut of the United States was a revelation and a nightmare rolled into one. German divisions often appeared modern on paper, with armored units and mechanized infantry, but in practice their logistics were painfully outdated. Horses remained the backbone of supply transport, a fact that shocked German soldiers themselves when compared to the glossy propaganda posters of the Reich. Letters from the front describe with bitter humor how elite divisions marched alongside animals as though the war were being fought in 2 centuries at once. Soldiers cursed the endless mud that slowed wagons, the exhaustion of animals collapsing under heavy loads, and the frustration of watching opportunities for rapid advance lost because supplies simply could not arrive in time. To then hear reports of Americans moving entire armies forward in days, armies carried entirely by motor vehicles, was both humiliating and demoralizing. The Red Ball Express in France epitomized this difference. German soldiers who faced it described endless convoys of American trucks rushing supplies from the beaches of Normandy to the rapidly advancing front. The operation moved hundreds of thousands of gallons of gasoline every day, ensuring that tanks and aircraft never faltered for lack of fuel. German units, bogged down in shortages, marveled at the efficiency and speed with which the Americans sustained momentum. Prisoners captured during the breakout from Normandy confessed their astonishment at the way American supply lines functioned like clockwork. To them, it seemed less like war and more like an industrial machine in motion, one that could not be stopped by any tactical brilliance on the battlefield. The psychological blow of this motorized abundance was immense. German soldiers realized that their own mobility, once the key to blitzkrieg, had been crippled by shortages. Tank divisions were often reduced to infantry support roles, while motorized units found themselves immobilized. Soldiers joked bitterly that their boots, not their engines, would win the war, but the humor could not mask their despair. Against an enemy that could move supplies across entire continents in days, their own reliance on animal power felt medieval. Even the sight of jeeps, small, agile vehicles used by American officers and scouts, provoked envy as they seemed to appear everywhere, darting across battlefields with endless reserves of gasoline to fuel them. Captured documents reinforced these impressions. German intelligence officers studying American logistics were shocked at the efficiency of petroleum distribution. Pipelines, portable pumps, and storage depots ensured that fuel flowed like blood through the Allied body. Soldiers at the front would later admit that they had underestimated the importance of such systems. They had believed, early in the war, that bravery, discipline, and superior tactics could offset shortages. But by 1944, when American armies were sweeping across France faster than German forces could retreat, the truth was undeniable. Fuel abundance, carried by mechanized convoys, had become a weapon as decisive as any tank or gun. The sight of this abundance often broke morale. German units that attempted counterattacks found themselves stranded when gasoline ran out mid-operation, forcing them to abandon valuable equipment. Meanwhile, American counterblows came swiftly, powered by convoys that seemed to have no end. Soldiers muttered that they were fighting not against men, but against machines, machines that never stopped, machines fueled by rivers of oil. The realization was bitter. No amount of tactical skill could outpace an army that was always moving, always supplied, always ready. By the late stages of the war, when the German front collapsed on both east and west, soldiers knew that their inability to match America's motorized might had doomed them. The very image of endless convoys of trucks and jeeps became, in their memories, the most haunting symbol of the enemy's superiority. While they dragged wagons through mud, the Americans paved their way with gasoline. And in that contrast, many Germans saw the inevitability of defeat written clearly before their eyes. By the closing months of the war, the final realization struck German soldiers with devastating clarity. America's endless fuel reserves had been the hidden hand guiding every defeat they suffered. What had once been whispered in disbelief among the ranks, rumors of convoys stretching beyond the horizon, of refineries that never ceased working, of bombers flying in waves without pause, was now accepted as undeniable truth. The Reich had gambled on speed, surprise, and daring to overcome its shortages, but those qualities had limits. Against an opponent with oceans of oil, the outcome had been decided long before the first American soldier fired a shot. Soldiers retreating across France and Belgium after the collapse of 1944 felt this truth in their bones. Their tanks lay abandoned on roadsides, their engines dry, their hulks burned to prevent capture. Their artillery was dragged by exhausted horses that often died in their traces. Their supply lines, stretched and broken, offered nothing but rationed scraps of fuel that never arrived in time. In contrast, American armies surged forward with terrifying speed, their Sherman tanks never halting for want of gasoline, their convoys filling the roads in an endless stream. German infantrymen trudging on foot could only watch helplessly as the motorized tide rolled past, unstoppable, fueled by a wealth of oil they could not even imagine possessing. In the skies above Germany, the lesson was even more brutal. Cities reduced to rubble by American bombers bore witness to an air campaign sustained by fuel supplies so vast that sorties never ceased. Day after day, the formations returned, their numbers seemingly undiminished. German soldiers manning flak batteries knew that even if they brought down a few, replacements would arrive without effort. They spoke bitterly of fighting a hydra. Cut off one head, and two more appeared, each powered by the same inexhaustible lifeblood. Every raid was a reminder that their own Luftwaffe, crippled by fuel shortages, could no longer rise to meet the enemy with any real strength. The collapse of the Eastern Front told the same story. German panzer divisions, once the terror of Europe, were reduced to fighting as static strongpoints because their vehicles lacked fuel to maneuver. Soldiers recalled the shame of destroying their own tanks rather than letting them fall into Soviet hands, machines rendered useless not by enemy fire, but by empty fuel tanks. At the same time, American-supplied Red Army units advanced relentlessly, their trucks and aircraft fueled by the very convoys that Germany had failed to disrupt. For German soldiers, it was proof that oil, not just manpower, had become the deciding factor of the war. In prisoner-of-war camps after Germany's surrender, soldiers spoke openly of this realization. They admitted, sometimes with bitter humor, that the war had been lost not in Stalingrad or Normandy, but in the oil fields of Texas, California, and Oklahoma. "We fought against gasoline itself," one captured officer declared, "and gasoline cannot be beaten." Diaries recovered from the final days of the Reich echoed this sentiment, men writing not of enemy bravery, but of enemy resources. They saw that courage, discipline, and sacrifice had been ground down not only by superior numbers, but by the unending flow of fuel that powered every American weapon. For German soldiers, this understanding was both devastating and strangely liberating. It allowed them to explain why their sacrifices had been in vain, why no brilliance of tactics or ferocity of battle could reverse the tide. They had fought hard, often to the very end, but they had fought an enemy sustained by reserves beyond comprehension. To them, it was as though the United States had waged war not merely with men and machines, but with rivers of oil that no blockade, no campaign, no desperate counterattack could ever dry up. And so, when the guns finally fell silent in May of 1945, the memory that lingered most among many German soldiers was not only of the battles lost or comrades fallen. It was the sight of American convoys stretching to the horizon, the constant roar of engines that never ceased, and the endless barrels of fuel that seemed to materialize wherever they were needed. In those images, they recognized the true face of their defeat. Oil had been the silent weapon, and in its abundance, America had crushed the Reich as surely as any army on the battlefield.